to the fifth AIMI Happy Hour. We're so glad you could join us. And you may have noticed that we no longer have just 6 of us. We are 8 and soon 9 of us today. We're so glad you could join us. And you will actually basically be getting 50% more happy hour for free is really what this means. So we're really excited for you to enjoy that. And so because there's some new faces, there's some older faces, I figured it'd be quicker just to kind of go around. But today's topic, after we introduce ourselves, is going to be all about who pays for AI. And we're going to talk about some recent developments that some of you may have heard of. And then we're going to go through some back and forth from many different perspectives. As you can see, we have a lot of experts here today who can weigh in on this topic. And hopefully we can create some new insights and have some fun. So if you want to kick it off, Melissa, I see you in the top of my screen. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and then we'll kind of go around?
Sure. Hi, I'm Melissa Davis. I'm a happy hour newbie, so thank you for inviting me. I'm an advisor for Nines Radiology, and I also am assistant professor at Emory, where I am medical director for quality. Before joining Emory, I was at Yale, where I worked to bring in several AI technologies into our emergency radiology department. So I'm excited to be a part of this conversation.
Awesome. Welcome, Melissa, and hopefully we don't scare you off when we get you back again next time too. Kurt, I have you up next. If you want to introduce yourself.
Great, thanks, Matt. I've been on sabbatical, so I'm also a happy hour newbie. Happy to be here. So I'm professor of radiology and biomedical informatics at Stanford, and I'm director of the AIMI Center. Happy to be here. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks for joining us. Nina.
Hey everyone, I guess I'm the first non-newbie, although this is just my second time on, and I had so much fun last time. I was really excited to be invited back, so thank you. I am a radiologist. I work at Radiology Partners. I was actually the first rad to ever join, so they call me Rad 1. And I have a background in applied mathematics and optimization theory, which I did before I even got into medicine. And so I've always been sort of obsessed with using technology to make us better. And my role in RP is as the Associate Chief Medical Officer for Clinical AI.
Awesome, thanks, Nina. It is good to have you back. Chris, you're up.
Well, hey everyone, it's nice to be in the box together here. My name is Chris Hess. I'm the chair of radiology at the University of California, San Francisco. A lot of interest in AI, a lot of activities in AI, and looking forward to discussing this topic.
All right, yeah, thanks, Chris, for joining us. Appreciate it. Luke.
Yeah, hi, Luke. I mean, I'm a regular, I guess. So I'm a radiologist and a AI researcher, and I write a blog. I think that's all I need to say.
We lost a little bit of you there,
but
we're assuming we'll just dub in some old introduction of yourself from last time. All right, Hugh, you're up.
Hi there, I'm Hugh. I used to be a radiologist, and now I'm just a random British guy on this show. No, but I've worked at 2 AI startups, and now I consult for companies trying to get regulatory approvals and things like that for their products.
We have to have a British guy on every show, Hugh, so thank you for serving that purpose. Sharon, you're up.
Not quite sure what my purpose is, and I recently found out that I am the only non-doctor in this group, but I am working on the intersection of AI and medicine, specifically with GANs right now, and I'm coming from more of an AI background, so.
Thanks, Sharon. All right, and I know we have Judy joining us, who many of you know is another regular, but she's coming a little bit later. So to kick it off, since we have a lot to talk about, I would like Luke, who just wrote a fantastic blog on some recent developments with regard to payments for AI models in medical imaging, specifically with a company called Viz.ai. And it has many different twists and turns, as Luke dramatically wrote in his blog post. And I'd like to have him kind of kick this off so all of us are on the same page when we start the discussion. So Luke, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Hopefully my connection stays solid. I don't know why it would drop out, but Look, I'll just be really brief. I think Nina's going to go into some more detail in a second. But essentially, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the first Medicare reimbursement for AI in medicine. In particular, it's a radiology system that looks for strokes in urgent stroke imaging and kind of bypasses the original radiologist read and directly informs an interventional radiologist that they need to do something to try and fix this person's clot in their brain. And there was a lot of immediate surprise, interest, talk about it. The headline outcome was that they're paying $1,000 per case, which turns out to be something of a under description of what's going on. But that's where we are now. It's the first time a government has started paying for AI in any broad sense. And it's a big news, exciting time. And I think Nina can probably explain more about the actual ins and outs of what happened.
Yeah, and I will echo that it is totally exciting, which is why I have not gotten much sleep this week, because I've been completely obsessed with it. And I just want to learn everything I can. I'm really new, just so everyone's aware, I'm new to DRGs. I never really thought about it much in the past. I know a lot about how radiologists are paid, but less about how the hospitals, and then there's this thing now that comes out that's called NTAP. So it's like an alphabet soup. Let's just go through a little bit, very basics, because that's where I am right now, about what these things are. DRG stands for a diagnosis related group, and it's essentially a kind of a bundled way to pay for a patient's care if you are an inpatient within the hospital. So it's for inpatients only. And it's bundling all the charges around a certain diagnosis. So that's what the diagnosis is. If you have a diagnosis of pneumonia, then there'll be a DRG around that. And there's a certain amount of money that your hospital gets paid for that one diagnosis. And all the line items that it costs you in order to take care of that patient. They took up a bed, they had medication, they had different consults. All of those line items add up. And the goal is that the DRG, reimbursement from CMS, should be able to cover those costs. So that's what a DRG is at my level of understanding. So what's this NTAP thing? And that's what that's what Viz got. It's an extra payment. NTAP stands for a new technology add-on payment. So it is in addition to a DRG. And it's meant so that any kind of new technology that's evolving that may take a while, like it usually takes years to get into the CMS system for anyone to recognize if it's worthwhile paying. The idea is that if you have new technology that's really helping out patients and patient care and it's optimizing outcomes, we should have a way to incentivize people to be able to use that early on. So money is incentive, and so NTAP is additional payment on top of the DRG that incentivizes these new programs. And there's a few things that you need in order to qualify for an NTAP. And I'll just say from a very basic standpoint, N stands for new, and that seems to be the biggest one. Is it has to be new. It's got to be new technology. And it has to be, if that technology was FDA approved, it has to have been FDA approved within the last 3 years. The next one is that the technology has to be underpaid from the current DRG system. And this is where a lot of the $1,000 headline is maybe not so accurate. You actually only get this payment if the DRG that's applied to that patient care is less than the cost of that patient care. So if the hospital is losing money on that patient and they used the system, then you get some payment for that. So that's the second part. And then the third part is it has to have clinical improvement. So it is a $1,000 potential benefit for a hospital. And I think it's awesome and amazing. The limitations are, one, you have to have, of course, apply the technology. Two, it has to be an inpatient. These are not for outpatients. So if someone comes into the ER and we're not sure if they have a stroke or not, and we apply the technology and the technology says, no, there's no, large vessel occlusion, and they don't become an inpatient, they, go to a different care mechanism, the payment will not apply to those people. And then the third, let's say all of that is true. You apply the technology, the patient does have an LVO, they become an inpatient, then you only get that line item of extra dollars if your DRG is not paying as much as it actually costs you to take care of the patient, including the cost of this AI system. So I just wanted to provide the basics in the overview. I still think it's fantastic, but I wanted to recognize that there are some rules and regulations that go along with it. The other one thing that I'll mention is that the NTAP payment is a temporary payment with the goal that over time, as you get more information by using the temporary payment, that any changes should be made to the DRG afterwards. So after 3 years, they say, well, we're not going to give you the NTAP payment anymore. We're now going to build something potentially into the DRG. So for this payment, there's 1 year of available payment right now.
So you're saying this sounds like, and this is usually part of the cocktail hour, people like start saying, hey, where's the appetizers? Because now we're getting too into the policy, but this is a serious list of things you just listed. You said it has to be new, it has to be inpatient, it has to provide improvement in care. It has to be part of a DRG, which is a bundled payment, and the hospital has to lose money on that diagnosis. I mean, that's a long list of qualifiers. And I think one thing that I wanted to point out, I think this is good for the broader audience, and then we'll kind of hear everyone's thoughts. But, Hugh, I know you did a deep dive on what the actual evidence was to how it actually showed better outcomes. And I think that those of us here that are radiologists and work in medical imaging, I would be surprised to see what metric was used to make that determination. Do you want to make a comment about that?
Sure. Can I just say off the bat here, as a British person, I have no idea how much anything in medicine costs because the government just pays for it here. We never see a hospital bill. We have no idea. So, when someone said, oh, it's £1,000, I did some research on how much radiologists get paid, and it's much less than that here. So to answer your question, yes, they produced a paper. It's been published, and we should put the link in the YouTube description. It's essentially what's known as a health economics analysis. So they did a study. It was only small. I think it was on 42 cases or thereabouts, just to try and measure the improvement on time to treatment, I think they called it. So from presentation to when they actually had their clot actually treated by an interventionist. And they showed that using the system within this new pathway, that the time was significantly improved, which is fair enough. But I think what we have to mention here is that they aren't just paying for the AI. The AI is a small part of a complete change in the care pathway. So they're actually paying for a new care pathway of which the AI is a small but essential part. And that pathway would not be enabled without the AI being able to do what it can do. So in the health economics analysis, they're looking at that return on investment, and they're trying to model out if this care pathway can improve time to diagnosis, can it therefore improve downstream morbidity and mortality and quality of life of patients. The quicker you can cure or treat a stroke, the less likely it is they're going to have long-term paralysis or neurological problems, or and it may reduce death rates. So that's what they've shown in a relatively limited and small study. They had no control group. They only compared it to existing care pathway. What they didn't compare it to was a control group without the AI. They could have done it saying, well, how about if we just send all the scans straight to an interventional radiologist and not do it with the AI? Would that still improve things? I suspect it probably would, but as Luke will say, there aren't enough interventional radiologists awake to report these scans all the time. So that's my take on it so far.
Yes, and for me, the TLDR was really just that we're now saying that time, that is the average time it takes for the scan to get to the radiologist. Typical workflow, they interpret it and then they report those results. If you kind of skip the line with this application, you instantly get that 66 minutes or whatever it ended up being in that study. I find that fascinating, both from the workflow perspective and then all these other qualifiers. What does everyone else think? And maybe we can go around and just say, yeah, with this new background, or if you didn't know this, or if you already knew it, what was your general feeling of, what was your first thought, I should say, when you saw that Medicare CMS, which again was, I think a lot of us had maybe even said it in prior discussions, that that's going to be a big barrier to these technologies really getting any traction. Even with those qualifiers, Melissa, why don't we start with you? Were you surprised at this sort of development?
Yeah, I thought it was like a very big development for AI and radiology, and I was excited to see it because this has been the question all along. Like, how do you make it make sense within a radiology department from like a reimbursement perspective? And that didn't exist until now. I think like this is a way to open the door to creating some way for hospitals to get reimbursed for that, because it's all about the bottom line dollar for a lot of this implementation. I think Nina said something really important earlier, was that this is really an inpatient workflow. And so if I'm looking at this from an operations standpoint, if a stroke patient generally comes into the ED through the ED, I'm wondering how often are they inpatient versus outpatient? And I think one of the big things that people confuse the ED is with inpatient. And so I just want to make sure that everybody is aware on this call that ED is actually considered an outpatient service rather than an inpatient service. So if I was a hospital looking at how this technology is going to be implemented, if it actually makes sense for us to get it or not, I want to look at my patient population and see how many of my patients over the past 5 years or so got a stroke protocol through the ED versus inpatient. And I assume that it's not quite there yet for me. And so it's on the inpatient perspective side, but I think when they push it over to the outpatient perspective side, that's going to be huge. The other thing I was thinking, I think Hugh was spot on. Sorry, I'm used to calling people by their last names.
Don't respond to anything.
Yeah. Because I did a neuroradiology fellowship, and our workflows was that when a stroke patient came to the ED, I showed up at the scanner no matter what. I was the AI. And as soon as we saw the clot, we took the patient physically from the CT room up to the interventional suite. And so the big question is, how does it change your workflow? If it does or not, because there's a lot of variation across hospitals. So I think it's going to depend on those two things.
I think it's important to point out they modeled it on what's known as a hub and spoke system, where they didn't necessarily have interventional radiologists at the spoke hospitals. They had to get and then redirected to the hub as soon as the AI detected something. I imagine from what you just said, you were working at a hub where they actually had interventionists.
Yeah. So it might not make as much sense where I was, but it might make more sense elsewhere.
And as Luke will tell you, there's only 3 interventionalists in the whole of Australia or something ridiculous.
South Australia. South Australia. But I can actually add some numbers to this. I spoke to Chris Mancy, who's the CEO and co-founder of Viz, and he essentially opened up a lot of the evidence they supplied to CMS for this. So on this question of does it actually save time, because I saw a lot of people on Twitter saying the same thing, that we always read these studies within 5 minutes, and so there's no real, where's this 60-minute plus delay coming from? He essentially said that at a hub hospital, that there isn't much time saved. That the majority of saving comes from these spoke hospitals where there's often very few radiologists around. They're doing these stroke studies, but they don't have the same stroke service that you would in a large centre. You get this big change in time, particularly to retrieval to a large hub centre. And so that's where most of their clinical benefit seems to be coming from. This question of sort of outpatient, inpatient, again, he gave me some numbers, and he was, I've got in the second blog I wrote, it was so complicated it needed 2 blogs and I still didn't cover everything. In the second blog, we saw at a big hub hospital, they were doing a bit over 6,000 code strokes per year. These are the studies to look for these large vessel occlusions. And that would be all the code strokes. 6,500 is ED, it's inpatient, it's everything. But only a certain percentage of those go on to be inpatients. I think it was about half of those went on to be inpatients. From there, you cut it down, how many were eligible for Medicare, you end up with about 2,000, or about 1,000 that are inpatients with Medicare. And then you've got this needs to be a loss maker step. And so from over 6,000 code strokes done, only 140 were eligible for this NTAP payment, which really changes this whole idea of this $1,000 reimbursement, that you did these scans and use the AI on about 4,000 patients, but you're only eligible for reimbursement for 140. So if you actually spread that reimbursement across all those patients, you end up with about $30 reimbursement per use, which is much more like what we see in mammography these days, and much more like what another company, IDX, is applying for with their outpatient service payments. So, it's not as dramatic as we thought it was going to be when we saw this $1,000 headline. It's the vast majority of patients do not get reimbursed because they're out, because they don't enter the hospital, because they're not under Medicare, and because they don't make losses.
Yeah. And I think that if you're a spoke hospital that is applying this treatment so that you can fast forward the care, those 60 minutes, I don't think that hospital would actually get paid because they're not going to be an inpatient in that hospital. They're going to go somewhere else. So I think you have to consider that as well. It's really meant for the, let's say you get transferred from a place that used the technology, and so they were able to fast forward, and you're a hub, and Melissa, they're transferring to you. If you want to get that payment, I think you have to redo the scan. I know I'm sounding kind of negative about it. I'm actually really excited about it, and I want to congratulate Biz on being able to do this and being an innovator in this space, because I think although there is a lot that I want to make sure people are aware of with regards to the payment, and that it may not be as it seems based on flashy headlines, it still is a great innovation, and that can move us forward with overall business case for AI.
Can I make
go ahead, Hugh.
I wanted to make it to step back out of radiology and talk about AI in general and try and answer the question, who actually pays for AI in general? People talk about the fact that we have AI around us. We have Alexa and we have Siri and we have face recognition. We don't pay for that. We buy the products that come with it bundled in, but we don't pay for it every time we use it. And I'm not actually aware, off the top of my head at least, of anywhere where we're paying per use of AI in any sector.
There are some companies that charge per use, per image analyzed and so on, and it's usually a very small amount, in the order of cents. But no, I mean, most services are paid for by subscription. In this case, the CMS payment is essentially meant to cover the cost. The CMS is very interested in not overpaying for a service, and so they've tried to balance it out so the subscription cost gets covered, but you don't get anything more than that in an ideal world, which I think makes sense from a sort of financial care perspective in a large health system.
I mean, there's a lot of other AI companies out there. It's Kurt, you have a slide where it's full of them. Chris, I know you work with some of these. Nina, you clearly implemented these. You may have the most experience out of any of us in your practice. Who is paying for those other ones? Let's put Viz AI aside just for a second. There's a lot of other models out there, right? A lot of other deployments. Who's paying for that? How is that working? Kurt, I don't know if you want to start, or Chris.
I'll go ahead. Sure. There are a lot of companies. I think we had 130 companies who were at the AI showcase at RSNA last November, all of whom were doing this kind of AI. So it's a huge industry. But I think most people thought, I certainly thought, that it would be paid for much as any other software application. If you have a RIS or a PACS or an advanced imaging application, you purchase that, and there's going to be some AI embedded or not. And that's paid for out of the technical component. And so the hospital purchases that if it has an ROI to that hospital. So this was really a revolution that I know I didn't see coming. As the person with the most gray hair here, I think, at least the least hair, let's say, I just have to give a little bit of history as to why I think people were skeptical, which is, if you look back at the last time we had AI, which was breast CAD, this is now 15, 20 years ago. It came out, everyone thought, wow, this is an amazing technology. It ought to be helping, seems to be helping mammographers to interpret breast images. And there was a big push actually led by, I think, my representative, Anna Eshu. This was now a long time ago. A lot of Congress got into the act and said, oh, we really need to do this. And so they added this extra payment for this AI. And of course, immediately when that happened, everybody adopted it. And so, and then of course, we learned later, there's some good research to show that looked at hundreds of thousands of cases in a large study and showed that actually that's probably not helping very much, if at all. So I think we have to be really careful. And so CMS was rightfully focused on the ROI. If you look at that document that's made public, it's like a Socratic dialogue of CMS and the company back and forth about proving the ROI in various aspects. But I think the policymakers are kind of in a tough spot because the payment, you know, our payment system is designed kind of per service or per patient, whereas the cost of this is this subscription model. So those two things don't align very well. And then, as Hugh said, they're really paying for a care pathway, but there's nothing to require anyone to actually implement the whole care pathway. It seemed to me, I didn't see that. So you get into difficult situations where there are some unintended consequences of this, and we may get into that area again, I think, with these technologies.
Yeah, I agree with Kurt. I think in many ways, I think AI technologies, certain ones of them anyway, are becoming a commodity. And so in many ways, they're the next evolution of technology that you'd find in kind of any imaging innovation. So in an MR scanner, say, or in the wrist packs. And the historical way of this technology being adopted is basically it gets moved into the big vendors. It's the PACS vendors, the wrist vendors, the scanner vendors. And that again gives them a competitive advantage or a competitive position in the free market, and buy my scanner instead of yours. And if you even move it further upstream, most health systems, when they look at purchases like scanners and packs and these big items, they have separate capital and operational budgets, and almost always that's in the capital budget, as Kurt's saying. And so this subscription model is in an operational budget, which is kind of hard for, I'd say, conventional health systems to follow.
I'll just add one more thing before I cede the floor to everyone else, so I'm not talking too much. But the one really important point of this story in particular is that a lot of the ROI was decided outside of CMS by the hospitals before the NTAP payment. So this system apparently is already in 500 hospitals around the US. And the reason that made sense from a financial perspective for hospitals is that this system seems to increase the rate of thrombectomy. So it gets more people into through the stroke pathway quicker from the spoke hospitals to the hubs, and more patients get thrombectomies. Why does that matter? It's because thrombectomies have a much higher DRG payment than stroke patients that don't get thrombectomies. So they get about double as much money from CMS already. And that means these patients are much less likely to make losses for hospitals. So there was already a financial incentive to use this system, at least according to Chris Mancy, the CEO. But it seems to be the case too that hospitals were using it. And the NTAP here seems to be trying to just incentivize enough by covering costs, and perhaps incentivizing these smaller spoke centers to use the system, where it seems like a lot of the benefit might be going to the hubs. But the incentive, return on investment, and benefit to patients seemed like it was there already. And I sort of said at the closing point of the second blog that maybe this system isn't actually a way to make AI viable. In this case, it seems like it may just be an endorsement of viable AI.
And I want to add to that. So when we think about health economics, it's always important to think about who is paying, right? And so if you do the analysis from the perspective of an individual patient, which is, I think, the way that this was viewed, you'd say, well, for that patient, they get their thrombectomy that much sooner, brain is saved and cost is saved. But if you look at paying from the perspective of the system as a whole, it makes more patients eligible for thrombectomy. So how those costs balance out, it's not entirely clear that it's a savings. Now, it's obviously a health benefit to the system as a whole, but not necessarily a cost savings.
Yeah,
I think it speaks to the fact that the American healthcare system is fundamentally broken, and there are completely perverse incentives in terms of payment. I mean, I can say this.
European perspective here.
Yeah, like, but
You're just lobbing tomatoes from over the Atlantic. It's just, you know.
It's
glass
true. I mean,
houses, Hugh, come on.
I mean, I'm not saying our system is perfect by any means. It's falling apart at the seams. I'll admit that. But it seems that, as Luke said, this is essentially incentivizing hospitals to try and make more money by doing more thrombectomies, and that is the perverse incentive. They're more interested in that probably than saving a bit of time or the quality of a few patients' lives. And I think that reverse incentive has played a part in all of this somehow.
But they're aligned incentives. If you get to thrombectomy, you have a better outcome. That's what you want. You want a financial incentive to align with outcomes.
Yes, but like Kurt said, they're from different budgets and from different people's points of view. And I think it's the thrombectomy one, that extra payment is probably more attractive to the hospitals. And that's why they adopted them before this health economics analysis came out, which said, oh, and by the way, it also saves time and outcomes.
Yeah. I'm not arguing it's not the right thing to do. It's just that the economic consequences might not be what people expect.
True.
I'd be curious what the arrangement is between hub and spoke hospitals, because if you look at large systems, they're usually built with several of those types. And so the hub hospital, I would imagine that the hub hospital is subsidizing the cost to the spoke hospitals under a model like that.
And really, when you think about it, even though the DRG for this surgical, it's a surgical DRG instead of a medical DRG that they can do when they go to a thrombectomy, and that is it's a much larger component that they're paid, but their costs are probably higher too. So it's really not just about the amount that the amount of money the DRG is giving them, it's about how much their cost is versus the amount that they get. And I'm presuming, I mean, this is certainly what it sounds like, that the cost to DRG amount for a surgical is a lot better than it is for medical procedure.
All right, well, I think that, you know, from my perspective, you know, I'm seeing a lot of, you know, considerations about the cost and where this is going to go. And I don't know if we're going to have that solved, but I do wonder if we take a step back, and Sharon, Judy, this is going to be for you guys in particular, as we think about now the development of these models and the use case, right? Because you can almost pick anything, right? There's so many opportunities, right, in healthcare and medical imaging in particular. Does this mean that, you know, we're all going to need to open up the DRG book and start thinking about how we can design these use cases? Are companies going to need to sort of come to you with a pitch that includes some of these considerations, and we're all going to have to be like Nina and learn all of this alphabet soup about policy on this? I mean, how does this work for us as we're thinking about the use cases that we want to spend our time on?
Well, I would say that from the startup side, this has always been kind of top of mind in terms of how do you break into an industry, right? And so before this, it was definitely thinking about how do you, I don't want to say get around the FDA, but a lot of people are thinking about how do you get around needing an FDA approval to work in this space, to first break in and then slowly, let's like start our FDA approval as we do other things for the next 3 to 5 years. And I think this will be a very similar thing. When I first saw the news, I started 3 companies. No, just kidding. But so I'm really glad Nina brought up some of the caveats around that. But I do think it is something to consider as a small company or any company getting into a space. In order to get traction, they're going to look for that financial hook. And then maybe over time, and I hope over time, it will help with, you know, patient outcomes much more broadly than something that just looks like a perverse incentive from across the Atlantic. So I
think it's fair to say that health economics is the next sexy thing in AI. Everyone's going to be doing a proper analysis. I've just hired 2 health economic consultants to my consultancy because we're getting more and more demand for this kind of work. And I think it's the only way to really convince people to cough up the cash.
There's also a first mover advantage because it's all dependent on when you get to FDA approval and you have to be new. So being early in the process really gives you a huge advantage. I mean, we've been looking at pricing of these for a while, creating our own. So we have some experience here. And the business case has always been the big question. What is the business case? Who's going to pay for it? And until like maybe the last few years where people are like, all right, if I'm talking to a rad practice, the business case for you is improved efficiency. And if I'm talking to a hospital, the business case for you is decreased length of stay or increased procedures or maintaining your patients within your system. And if I'm talking to a payer, it's about decreasing cost. And you can get some benefit from all of those. All of the AI systems out there, or many of them, have some kind of benefit. But the benefit that you're getting is incremental. When you talk about CMS paying for this, that suddenly opens a completely new door. And I don't know, I almost feel like something like that really needs to happen for AI to be significantly utilized across the country.
Well, and I think if you look at the first wave of AI companies and AI applications, they were often, not to pick on anybody, but detecting a breast mass or a lung nodule or a brain hemorrhage or something like that, which is really cool technology, but really is equivalent to adding another menu item on your advanced imaging application. It's not going to have a major return on investment. It's going to be a convenience for the radiologist and something that's nice to use and may increase our accuracy incrementally. So I'm not sure that many of those companies are really equipped to take advantage of this, or to, let's say, create the right ROI justification in the way that Biz.ai did for their technologies. Perhaps when we get into some of the more, well, certainly the companies that do this image enhancement, image reconstruction, and reduce the cost of devices, there's an ROI there. Companies that have workflow applications where maybe you're prioritizing work lists, getting ICU patients out of the ICU sooner, or something of that nature. Eventually, we may have companies that have a suite of applications, all that apply to one imaging study, where they could even draft a report. Maybe that's a time savings for the radiologist that's significant. So there are some areas, but I'm not sure that the current AI industry is very focused on this. There are some, but there are many others that have a much smaller ROI. They're going to be hard to fit through this keyhole.
Well, what I'm wondering though, Judy, like you and I are here, we're the interventionalists. Does this mean we take over? Do we just bypass all those radiologists readings and we just say, we'll treat them right away? Is that, should we be leading this now? Is that what we're hearing?
I think that in this specific use case, like Kat, alludes to, and I think also Luke writes at the end of his blog, he says, if you would have ever picked a better use case, it would have been stroke. Because we also have to understand the systemic factors around stroke care, right? There's a lot of, everywhere you go in the hospital or on the bus, there's fast, like all these algorithms for stroke and what number to call. And then there's also a lot of innovation around stroke care. One is even the mobile ambulances, right? So that's also a new workflow where we have these ambulances equipped with CTs. And I think now with hyper MRI, now they're trying to get this portable MRI that you can have anywhere. And so, that is going to even shift sort of the diagnosis to, the field. But when, I work in a stroke center and also a level 1 trauma center. And what I realized though, in terms, which is sort of like the surprise that you'd tie that the use of this AI is what improves the workflow a little bit, is that there's a lot of sensitization by just the term stroke. Even the cleaner or the transport person knows that when they hear stroke, it means drop everything, time is brain. We need to transport this patient to the CT scan. No patients get scanned on the CT scan. It's held, are free for this specific patient. The neuro IR suite is now no longer built in terms of, utilization, like myself and you do cases every day. It's utilize, the time is because if we get a stroke, we need to act, immediately. So, I'm curious to see what will be the next breakthrough technology in a field away from directly stroke. But what I want to, I think for me, when you mentioned about replacing or obviously not being replaced for interventional radiologists, is this idea of task shifting, So will we find that maybe CMS will be interested in paying for someone if like, advanced provider like the APPs start to read some chest x-rays with AI, at a lower cost? I don't know. Will we see an area also a little bit where we completely remove the radiologists from the workflow and devalue their work? And so I just want to emphasize that technology is not neutral, and the areas where we deploy this technology actually end up having consequences on job satisfaction, or just sort of even just the value of work. And so the bigger, the difference in the past where you had CAD for breast is that it took a while to develop CAD for breast. Now with deep learning, and access to the right use case and the right tools, it may be very technically difficult to do what Hugh does, which is bring the product to market, but to develop something, the bar is low. So I'm really worried around this context of how AI is used and around by the people who use it, and especially knowing that these vendors will have even a bigger black box, which is like, this is my IP. So it's going to be very difficult to even audit the real performance in different workflows.
You touched on something very important there. You said something task shifting, and Hugh, I'll get to you about this, because I know we've talked about this too. I also want to hear from Chris from an academic perspective, Nina from the traditional super private practice perspective, and Melissa, you're in this hybrid role. Task shifting, how is that going to affect the practice? And Hugh, you want to make a comment about just some of the possibilities, I suppose?
Yeah, so I was just going to follow on from what Judy said. She said the best use case for AI is stroke, and we've now changed the mantra of time is brain to a marketing slogan, essentially. And that slogan doesn't translate to any other part of the body. Time isn't prostate or cancer. It doesn't. It's not as as urgent. So the last company I worked at was working on breast cancer. But you've got to remember, we have a completely different model here in Europe, and I think the ROI is even greater than stroke, in that in Europe there are 2 readers for every single mammogram, and if AI can become one of those 2 readers, you're making a 50% cost saving on the reading.
Huge.
So and in terms of task shifting, the breast radiologists here in the UK at least are desperate for it. They don't want to do the mammograms. That's a really boring part of their job. They want to go and do the patient facing stuff, or the complex MRI, or the oncology follow-ups. So there are some cases where task shifting is a good thing, but I completely agree with Judy. We need to be mindful of the other adverse or unforeseen consequences of when we start to do some more task shifting in other areas.
What do you think, Chris, from an academic medical center perspective? This Viz.ai or something similar to that could go straight to the neurologist and say, okay, they make a deal, and the hospital wants you to deploy it and implement it through the radiology system, and it may or may not completely fall within your the things that you want to do with the neuro interventional practice. How does this work from the academic medical center perspective? Are there some conflicts there? Are there some potential drawbacks? And is this a slippery slope, as we always say with these things?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. So, I think we've played that out. I would say specifically in the area of stroke, there are vendors that have software platforms that have kind of become mainstay. They don't use AI necessarily, but they kind of deliver results directly to the neurologist or to the interventionalist for that matter, and hopefully accelerate the transition of the patient to the interventional suite. But our experience in that is, I think there's a bit of a task shifting there, because the results are, it's like any human or any machine. The results are variable, and then they need explaining, and so often they learn pitfalls. And so the neurologists are now, I would say, coming with these cases and saying, well, I look at these new results, whether they be Viz.ai or something else, how do I interpret these? So it's the kind of search for information. It's not just delivery of like a binary lab-based product or anything like that. I think startups, certainly version 1.0 of medical AI startups, looked at looked at this like any other business. It's basically, let's reduce expenses. They can be tangible expenses, like the number of radiologists, or replace radiologists, or they could be intangible, like making the burden of some of the mundane radiology work easier, like Hugh just said. And there's some easy wins in that space. Operationally, if you enhance your workflow, if you do more patients, you see more revenue and you reduce your expenses. But for CMS and other payers, I think ultimately it's going to have to be about value and outcomes. So decreased length of stay, these healthcare economics variables. And so I think academic health systems are really going to be in a position to study those variables.
And I think that Melissa or Nina, what from the private practice perspective, so you're not in an academic medical center where some of these other specialists are, you're interacting with them at least at the same institution. How do some of these things work in those settings?
So I think that there's a lot to think about here, especially when it comes to AI, because typical AI right now is only diagnosing one thing. So we're only seeing a stroke, or we're only seeing a brain bleed, or we're only seeing a pulmonary embolus, we're only seeing a fracture. But we don't think about the fact that this patient may have something else going on with them, like they may have a mass that we haven't seen, or some sort of incidental finding that's going to turn into cancer at a later stage. And so until AI can be more comprehensive, I think you're always going to need at least some sort of competency on reading the entire image, which is what we train our residents to do, is don't focus on the one thing and then miss everything else that's happening on that patient. And so there was a study that I did a couple of years ago where we had a couple of cases of lung cancer that popped up, and we were able to go back and find them on cardiac CT. And so we are at our hospital, the cardiologists were reading that. So we went through and analyzed how many missed incidental pulmonary nodules were found when cardiologists read the CTs as opposed to when radiologists read them. And it was pretty significant enough that they shifted the work back to radiologists to look for the pulmonary nodules and do a second check after those studies had been read by the cardiologists. So I think that we have to think about the whole patient and not just the single disease when we're thinking about task shifting. The other thing is, like, I'm in a high volume situation because I'm in the emergency room all the time. And so when we think about, okay, let's enable APPs to read plain film so that, we can shift that work and I can focus on, the more higher value imaging studies like MRI or CT. I think that could contribute to radiologist burnout in the reading room. If I'm reading 150 and 200 cases a day, that negative plain film benefits me because I get to call something negative and my brain can really get around that and move on. If I'm reading something like a multi-trauma, 150 multi-traumas, it's not going to do well long-term for those patients. So I think we have to think about the entire process.
That's a great point. We talk about operating at the quote top of our license, but that means doing the most complex work all the time. I mean, Nina, you run a huge practice. It's potentially feasible that you could, send every super complex thing to one person, I suppose, in theory. That wouldn't work. Obviously, we've talked about burnout before. What are your thoughts about how some of that works with a practice like that?
There is some benefit of some kind of batching, but when you are taking it to that level of extreme, I totally agree with Melissa. I think you just get burnt out. As radiologists, we need that brain relax time. I mean, there's been a lot of studies on this, just about the brain, that you're supposed to only 45 minutes of the hour be actually concentrating that deeply. And what we don't correlate, we hear a lot of stats about, hey, this saves 30% of the rad's time. Well, does that 30% actually translate into more scans read? I mean, it might not. If you're really overworking the rad during that time and they're getting mentally exhausted, they may just take the break during those 30%. And you have to consider that. So, I think that there's ways where you can do it and make it very reasonable, but then there's ways where you go really too far. And then certainly as a radiologist, anytime I hear about bypassing a radiologist, it just kind of it hits me wrong. Clearly I'm biased, but it just, we're trained for a reason. And I think with AI, that training is going to evolve as our roles evolve a little bit to be the group that understands the capabilities of the AI. And we train this, we've learned a lot about it in rolling out AI in our practice. Just because you have an AI system, people actually think, oh, it's 100% of the time it's going to work. And it doesn't. And there's reasons why it doesn't work. And we need to, as the radiologists, be the ones that understand that. And if you bypass the people that have that knowledge, you can have a lot of problems.
I think we should really make clear here that, we're talking about bypassing and stuff. In this case, the reason this got through the FDA, the reason that, CMS has approved it and so on, one of the main points of this system is that at any point of the pathway, a radiologist still sees the study. So if it's positive, it goes to an INR or interventional radiologist. And if it's negative, it still gets read by a diagnostic radiologist. And even if it's positive, it'll still get read by a diagnostic radiologist. So in fact, what we've done is we've increased workload by using this system. So, when Judy was talking about some of this concern, and, radiologists have universally had this concern that we're going to lose work. What's happening here is we're getting extra reads by neuroradiologists, and they're doing 50 to 60% more thrombectomies. So, considering that's bread and butter for an INR, does this actually mean that we're going to need 50 to 60% more INRs? There's a couple of hundred of them in America. Is there suddenly this massive increase in need for workforce now? This is the opposite of what people were scared about. We're suddenly needing heaps more work to be done than we did before.
And now that there's a payment mechanism, so maybe we'll see more, right? I mean, this will be interesting to see if the workload increases. Do you suspect that that will be the case? And if so, what does that mean for the interventional neuroradiology groups that are already stretched thin, right? And how do they handle this sort of onslaught? It's going to be very interesting to see. I want to shift gears with our last time because I wanted to bring up one of Kurt's old tweets, which is what I like to do to mess with them occasionally. And Kurt, I do remember there was a tweet sometime, I don't know if it was a year ago, and you said something to the effect of, I wonder what's going to happen with layoffs in startups in AI. And I think it was related to some of the very obvious pivots that are going on, and they're probably still going on. And we all know from Silicon Valley speak, pivot means help me, please, right? For when a company completely changes what they're trying to do. What is your take on the stability of the market in general? And I'd like to hear from everybody, but starting with you, and then, is this a game changer? Are we going to see more pivots that are, again, sort of heading down? We're going to have a lot of VC guys that are going to be experts in DRG. What's going to happen, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think everyone, the entire industry, whether or not they are really well aligned with this new payment policy. And by the way, there's also a proposed rule from CMS that any breakthrough technology would be automatically eligible for 4 years of reimbursement. That's impressive if it gets approved. But so I think all of the industry will be thinking about how they might align with this kind of a payment policy. And I think that's a good thing. The pivot, usually means we still have the confidence of our investors, but we recognize that our current business strategy is not working. And so, yes, I think we've been seeing some of that. The layoffs that I've heard about have been mostly now, at least the latest ones have been COVID related. So you've had some companies that have pivoted and have, practice arms and that sort of thing. And, that's something that's susceptible to volumes. And as those go down, so I would assume those would be temporary. But no, I have not heard of any major shifts in the radiology AI industry in terms of employment. And it seems that these companies still have the confidence of their investors. And some of them are pivoting, and some of them, I would hope, are thinking more and more about ROI, because that's not only what CMS wants to see, but I think that's what makes a good business in the end anyway.
Yeah, and I think that the customer is going to depend on what do you think, Melissa? I mean, as coming from both the academic practice and the private practice kind of startup model, is this going to change your customer base? What you try to do, what you're thinking about?
I think, COVID had a large impact on radiology in general, especially in the outpatient setting. But we've seen it bounce back relatively quickly, and even seen volumes go above baseline if we look before in some cases. So I think that, it was like a temporary setback, but I'm not very worried about like continued layoffs within the spaces from the perspective that I've seen so far.
I do think from the AI industry that new technology follows the hype cycle that we all know about. And I do think we are coming into that period of consolidation. I know several AI vendors who were at RSNA last year who, while they did have a booth, they were also looking to sell themselves to other vendors because they're not doing as well anymore. And if you look at who's making investments in the technologies, it's not all the top tier investors that are putting as much money into it as before. So while you may say, hey, every year at RSNA, there's been a double in the number of AI companies, if you pull the covers up a little bit, I think there's starting to be some consolidation. And I think that makes sense. You can't have 140 winners. It just, there's no way to consolidate all that. I love that it brings through a whole bunch of new ideas, but ultimately there's going to have to be less players.
I think
Chris, you touched on this. Oh, go ahead, Sharon.
I think in addition to AI startups, something that I've thought about is how is Google or Salesforce or any of these really large companies doing AI medical research and product work? How are they going to react, and what part of the market will they want? I'll be honest, I used to work at Google and worked on and did think a lot about how to license the cloud API to the healthcare space in particular. And yeah, it's definitely very different from ads, but I think this suddenly opens up an avenue for that. And it does make me wonder how they're going to react to this as well.
I think that they're going to take the time is prostate tagline, and I think they're going to run with it.
Wow.
Sure.
Oh, that's not what I would expect, but okay.
Yeah. My sense of that is that the cloud vendors just want to sell cloud to healthcare, and they're using AI as a sweetener. But some of it is more about promoting the fact that there's this innovation happening, and you might have more access to that if you're working in the cloud. Some of it is perhaps they can sell that as a value-added layer. If you send your images up to our cloud and then back to your radiologist, it's going to come with all of these great new decision support features that maybe others wouldn't have. But I think we're really not very far down along that process. I think that the process of having huge risk-averse healthcare systems adopt a fully cloud strategy is something that's still a ways away.
I think it's the future, and healthcare is always slower to adopt it. Yeah. It is where we're going, and ultimately where we need to be. And what the cloud services are offering are these, like exactly Kurt said, is these microservices then containerized so that we can add on to our capabilities. I think we're going to have a huge amount of benefit when we are able to move there.
There's a good comment on the chat. There's a good comment on the chat about radio. There's a whole thing. Radiologists didn't spot gorillas on CT scans, so I replied, well, you can use pigeons to spot breast cancer. And the joke of the evening from Richard Levinson, well, pigeons work well in the cloud. Well done, Richard.
Okay, very good.
Oh, that is gold. That is absolutely gold. All right, well, I think we're out of time. I want to thank everybody. This was a lot of fun as usual. It's always great to see you. We had a big crew today. I think we solved everything, so I don't know if there's anything left to say, but we will be back next month, and we'll mix it up again. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks very much.